Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final Dig and Delve dialogue of this season. I think this is number 7. I've kind of lost track. They're all on our website, though, so if you've missed any, please feel free to catch up. Today, we're going to be talking about a huge topic, and that is critical race theory, one that surely everyone, if you haven't heard of the term, you've certainly heard a lot of talk about race, racism, and seen the effects, at least, of critical race theory in the workplace, in your school, in your community in some way. We are hoping to be able to unpack it, and I hope that we'll have a really great discussion with our speaker tonight, and that is Brandon Cleaver. Brandon is a speaker and a writer. He likes to focus on cultural issues in the context of Christian hope, and so that has brought him into the areas of slavery, urban issues, race and race relations, as we talked about today, and ethics. He has been involved with the Ratio Christi ministry and in leadership roles at his church. He has an undergrad, we call it undergrad here in Canada, in journalism. He's got a master's in apologetics from Biola University, and he is currently working on his MDiv at Moody. So Brandon's going to start us off with a bit of an overview on critical race theory, a bit of some background, but we really want to hear from you. And we really want this to be a forum where you can ask some of your questions that maybe you feel you don't have anywhere else to go with. And so we're going to use the platform we've been using all along, which is Slido. It is not difficult to go into Slido. You don't need an account or anything. You just use the URL and the I guess code that you see at the bottom of the screen, and you can see other people's questions. You can vote on them. Please submit your questions because we'd really like to. We're trying to have a bit of an extended dialogue time tonight with Brandon, so I hope that you will avail of that. Now, without further ado, we're going to launch into Brandon's opening words, and then we'll join you back afterwards for some Q&A.
Hey, Dig and Delve. My name is Brandon Cleaver. I'm so excited to be with you all here today. I've seen the roster of speakers that you've had this year and in the past years, and really seeing that roster, it's just a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to be a part of this conference. So thank you so much for the invitation. I want to especially thank Pastor George, Janice, Greg. I was on a call, I think it was about a week ago, with some local pastors and Christian leaders who, some of them, I believe, assist with the Dig and Delve conference. So I want to thank you all again for that wonderful time of fellowship together as well. So I do want to give just a couple of quick disclaimers right up front. Number one, after discussing a couple of things with some of the Dig and Delve folks, we thought it better to go a little bit on the shorter side. Now, this is a topic that people spend hours and hours, 16-week master degree classes on. So it's no way that I can really plumb the depths of critical race theory in about 20 or 25 minutes. But what I hope to do is give you a bit just to clarify some of the misconceptions and just to help you have a better grounding for what critical race theory is, what it aspires to do, and things like that. Also, I understand that this will probably primarily be a Canadian audience. Now, critical race theory sort of emerged in the United States context. So I am going to have to talk a lot about that context, but I'll hopefully describe some things. I think some things you may already be aware of or familiar with, but maybe some things that you may not be familiar with. I'll try and give a bit of a description. Again, if you want me to elaborate on any of those things, I'd be happy to do so during the Q&A time. So again, let me jump right into this talk. And again, I'm gonna go through it and be a little bit on the more brief side, but hopefully it's still some nuggets in there that I hope provide some clarity on critical race theory for you. Now, one of the biggest issues with critical race theory in the sort of cultural conversation is the fact that there's so much misunderstandings and so many misconceptions about what it actually is. Like many things, the story of CRT is filled with all types of intricacies. I mean, take, for example, the phrase or the term itself, critical race theory. For a lot of people, this signifies this idea that there's this one unified, singular theory, when that couldn't be further from the truth. And we'll get into more of what that actually looks like a bit down the road in this talk. But just so you understand up front that what I'm trying to do is not give you a talk that's going to persuade you to become a critical race theory or critical race theorist or become pro CRT. And I'm not trying to give you a talk that's going to cause you to be anti critical race theory. What I'm trying to do is model a posture of understanding to really clear up what it actually is, and then hopefully provide some thoughts on how we as Christians can engage with critical race theory and perhaps critical race theorists themselves. I do want to read to you something that I thought was quite interesting when I read it from a Christian, not a Christian, but a conservative journalist. He said, "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular to Americans. We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category." Now, what I thought was interesting about this is that you didn't hear anything about whether critical race theory was true, if it was untrue, if you could glean some insights from it, if we should, if it's totally antithetical, for example, to the Bible or whatever. It was just sort of this message that I often see now that's mired in misconceptions and misnomers and confusion. So what I want to do again is hopefully provide some clarity on critical race theory. So just so you know the trajectory of the talk, the aim is threefold. Number one, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the roots of CRT. Many people want to start with the definition of critical race theory itself, but to really understand the definition, we have to understand where it came from, where it sort of emerged from. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, a few minutes, talking about the roots of critical race theory. Then I want to go to some of the common tenets, and I sort of use air quotes there because, well, we'll get to that in the tenets section. And then thirdly, I want to just give a couple quick thoughts on Christian engagement with critical race theory. So one of my favorite writers of all time, James Baldwin, he wrote during the Harlem Renaissance period around the mid to later 1900s in the United States. And he was a culture critic in a way. And he had some really great insights. And one thing that he said about history has always stood out to me. He said that history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. And if we pretend otherwise, we are literally criminals. History is so important. It's so important. It informs how we got to where we are now, and perhaps where we'll go from here. And as Christians, of course, as we read the story of God's redemptive story from all the way from Genesis to Revelation, we see this beautiful history, and that comes to bear on us as modern Christians. So the history itself is so important to us as not only as Christians, but really just as human beings in general. So imagine with me, if you will, this little girl. She's a kindergartner, a young black girl. She has a white bow in her hair. She's very neatly dressed, and she has like this little briefcase that almost like a little child would have. And she's buttressed by these 4 adult white males with all navy blue suits on. Okay, and they're walking up the street, and there's a crowd ahead of them. And this crowd you see all types of jeerings and movement and things being said. And from the perspective of this little girl, when she sees them, she's thinking, oh, this must be some type of wonderful celebration or some beautiful thing going on. But as she and these gentlemen approach this crowd, there's these signs. You see signs that desegregation is Marxist, that integration of races and ethnicities is against the Bible. And you see all these different Bible verses quoted. You see racial epitaphs on some of these signs. And as this girl, her name is Ruby Bridges, she would be escorted into the school by these four men. And these four men were actually four federal agents that were there to make sure that no harm came to this little girl, as she would be the first African American person to enter an all-white school after the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, there was also Brown versus Board of Education 2 and 3, but for the sake of this talk, we'll just talk for a moment about Brown versus Board of Education 1. So this case, the purpose of it was to deal with the desegregation of schools. And of course, this came on the heels of another landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that happened years before, that actually instituted the famous quote, you probably heard of it, separate but equal. So you've probably seen pictures of back in the early 1900s or so forth, whites only here, or colors only here, or whites can sit at the front of the bus and blacks have to sit at the back of the bus. These were laws that were instituted from Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Brown v. Board again came in and said that, hey, we're going to desegregate the schools and allow for various races and ethnicities to come together for an education. Now, the first African American Supreme Court judge, Thurgood Marshall, he was dealing with this case, but he wasn't the only African American that was dealing with this case. It was also African American by the name of Derrick Bell. Now, Derrick Bell will go on to become the widely known as the progenitor or the forefather of critical race theory. But see, he was a lawyer that not only dealt with this case, but dealt with many other cases of desegregation that followed Brown v. Board. Actually, he dealt with about 300 different cases of desegregation. He also worked with another civil rights leader named Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers himself focused more on the voting rights for African Americans, but Medgar Evers was part of sort of this trifecta of civil rights leaders, himself, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. All three of them, of course, were assassinated before the age of 40. And actually, the weekend that Medgar Evers was assassinated, in his driveway, Derrick Bell was actually supposed to be with him, but Medgar encouraged him to go home and be with his family. So this is the environment, this is the milieu with which Derrick Bell was brought up in. And Bell became so disenchanted and disillusioned with the lack of results of Brown v. Board and the incredible resistance towards it, that he famously stated that noble image, dulled by resistance to any but minimal steps toward compliance, has transformed Board into a magnificent Brown v. Board, into a magnificent mirage. In other words, Bell is simply stating Brown v. Board was nothing more than a symbol, and it was a symbol that lacked substance. You see, the point of Brown v. Board wasn't just to desegregate, but it was to deal with the more important issues, the lack of education, the continued and preponderance of racial disparities and inequities, and it didn't deal with any of these things. And so he said that we need to take a stronger look at the vexing relationship between race and law and legal culture in the U.S. history. So that's sort of where the thought process was. But let's talk for a moment about the two incidents that actually served as the emergence of critical race theory. One was a student protest at Harvard, and the second was the 1986 and 1987 critical legal studies conferences. So the student protest at Harvard, Derrick Bell became the first tenured African-American Harvard Law School professor. He ended up resigning from that position because he wanted to hire an Asian American woman, but the Harvard sort of nixed his hire. But this wasn't any candidate. This woman ranked in the top 3 of 600 other candidates. So after he resigned, his students were very upset, and they said, hey, you need to replace him with another academic of color to continue on Bell's work of analyzing constitutional law with race and ethnicity and these communities of color. And Bell would go on to become the dean of the University of Oregon. But Harvard responded, and Harvard said that there were no qualified black scholars that merited Harvard's interest. So the students saw this, and they sort of instituted their own way of continuing Bell's work. And so they formed the first institutionalized expression of critical race theory, what became known as the alternate course. And of course, this continued Bell's work on analyzing American law through the lens of race. So again, this was the first institutionalized expression of critical race theory. Now, second, then, the critical legal studies conferences. So critical legal studies was essentially an attempt by scholars, and it was primarily white scholars. It was some scholars of different ethnicities and things like that, but it was primarily a field for white scholars and lawyers. And their attempt was to examine the notions that the law is blind, that the law actually is inherently socially biased against some of the more disadvantaged groups in our society, and and that it upholds power structures, and in particular some of the status quo. Now, at one of these conferences, there were some critical race theorists that attended it, and essentially they had a problem with the fact that critical legal studies failed to incorporate the role of race and the lived experience of people of color in their critiques of rights within the law. So for them, this furthered the need for scholarship and examination from a particular lens that looked at the relationship of race and law. So again, we have the student protest and then the aftermath of these critical legal studies conferences. So then what is critical race theory? Again, some people think it's this one singular sort of unified theory. And let me just give you a tip. If you're ever listening to a talk or reading an article about critical race theory, and this person does not express some of the inherent nuances within critical race theory or the wide diversity of thought within the field, I'm not saying that they won't say anything that's helpful, but you should be a little cautious with whether they really understand critical race theory, because it is very, very vast, and there's a variety of thought within it. You have folks like I mentioned, Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Robert Williams, Gene Stefanik, Gary Peller. The list goes on and on. And if you read their different works, as I've read many of them, you'll see that they have some slight differences and nuances to their definitions of what critical race theory is, and even some of the other definitions as you drill down into some of the intricacies of critical race theory. In fact, one theorist actually said there are not a canonical set of doctrines or methodologies to which we all subscribe. And that can be hard for us as Christians, because we literally have a canon. Although we do have some differences in doctrines and things like that, we do have a canon that helps us hopefully to light a path towards the truth. Now, before I get to the actual definition, there are two main types of critical race theorists. Number one, there's the materialists, and there's also the discourse analysts. The materialists are literally those who look at the material or the real world and see how these real world conditions affect communities of color. And not only how they affect these communities, but they also desire to or hope to create a better life for them. Now, again, for us Christians, this shouldn't be anything that's new. In fact, the Christian scholar Nicholas Worterstorff, he has this phrase that he uses. I'm not sure if the genesis of this phrase was with him or with someone else, but I've heard him use it quite a bit. The quartet of the vulnerable. In other words, these four people groups throughout the scope of the Bible that tend to be the most vulnerable of all the classes, of all the different people. And this is the widow, the orphan, the resident alien, and the poor. And the Bible constantly talks about rectifying the ills that help to contribute or are used against these vulnerable classes. And then we have the discourse analysts. Now, the discourse analysts deal more with the construction of ideas and categories around these issues of race and racism. So, for example, someone like Kimberly Crenshaw might be considered more of a discourse analyst than a materialist, or maybe she has some work where there's a compilation of the two, but certainly her work with intersectionality, probably a term that you've heard of before, is more in line with dealing with the ideologies behind some of these things and the implications from those ideologies. And there may be some questions about intersectionality. We can discuss those during the Q&A time. Now, there are some unifying factors, though, that I hope that can bring us to a somewhat of a solid definition of what critical race theory is. And for that, I've sort of compiled a definition that looks at 4 C's. Okay, critique, challenge, commitment, and change. Right? Critique, challenge, commitment, and change. So here's the definition. It's a bit of a longer one, so if you want me to repeat it during Q&A, I'd be happy to. Critical race theory is a movement by scholars and activists to critique the relationship between race, law, and the history of white supremacy in the United States, to challenge the construction of race in legal culture and society, and to exhibit an ethical commitment to changing the historical and ongoing implications of the relationship of race and law in the United States. Again, I know that's a bit of a longer definition, but there's a lot to critical race theory. So I hope that encompasses a bit of some of the various nuances within the theory. So then let's quickly look, as I see my time is getting short here, let's quickly look at just a few of the common tenets within critical race theory. Now, I have about 7 or 8 here, and for time's sake, I'm only going to go over a few, but again, I can talk about some of the other ones in the Q&A time. So number 1, that race or racism is a social construction. Race itself, they're essentially saying, is not a biological fact. And we know this through, for example, the Human Genome Project, the largest international science collaborative project in the history of the world, and it spanned about almost 20 years, I believe. And also, not only is race a social construction, but that it wasn't just constructed to sort of divide or talk about the differences of people groups, but there was an inherent hierarchy that was integral to the construction of race. So we see this, for example, in antebellum slavery, various caste systems, things like this. That it's not just that we're going to look at these people as maybe having darker skin than another, or different shapes or colors of different facial features, but it's also the idea that some of these people are subordinate to other people groups. So again, it's that hierarchy part that's so important, and we see this played out in lands across, not just in the U.S., but in other places. In fact, there's a really good book called The Global View, an Oxford book called The Global View of Race and Racism, which really helps to see a broader view of this phenomenon. Also, another tenet is critical race theory recognizes that race is endemic to American life. So pretty much what that's saying is that race or racism is something that is a permanent fixture in American society. Now that can sound quite hopeless. And actually, Derek Bell, in his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, he recognizes that, and he says, the challenge throughout has been to tell what I view about racism without causing disabling despair. Now for Christians, the question is, should this disable us? Should this reality, if it is a reality, again, cause us any type of a disabling posture towards this idea? Well, we know that sin is something that's not going to be fully done away with this side of heaven. And for example, in Matthew 26, verses 11, Jesus says that the poor will always be with us. But just because the poor and poverty will always be a permanent fixture of our society, it doesn't preclude us from engaging and trying to do our best to alleviate the circumstances that help contribute to poverty, or the circumstances that contribute to individuals who are poor. Another one here, critical race theory is interdisciplinary and eclectic. Now I want to read the second sentence because I know there's going to be some questions about this that we can elaborate on later. It borrows from several traditions, including liberalism, law and society, feminism, Marxism, post-structuralism, critical legal theory, pragmatism, and nationalism. Now, I know there's a lot of isms in there, and some, especially Marxism, where people will say, oh my goodness, Marxism, we can't have anything to do with that. And I knew that there were some ties there. So it's not quite what you think. But again, please ask me during Q&A, or maybe I'll just have a couple words about that, because I think that's so important, because that's one of the bigger issues that comes up. And I want to give an extended period of time to really talk about that. And then finally, critical race theory works toward the end of eliminating racial oppression as part of the broader goal of ending all forms of oppression. So their broader goal, again, is all forms of oppression that affects all people. But what they're focusing on is this racial dynamic. It's no different than, my son and I, we volunteer for this group called Serve the City, and we literally do different projects to serve the city of Detroit, and particularly those who may be a bit more disadvantaged or just don't have the same resources that we may have. But that doesn't mean that I don't care about the ongoing issue of sex trafficking, or of course the abomination of abortion, of the genocide that's going on. It doesn't mean that because I'm focusing here that I don't care about these other things. And I think that's what the critical race theorists are saying. We're focusing on this oppression, but we recognize that this is a part of a broader scope of more oppressions that are replete within our world. So that's just a couple of theories. So I only have about 5 minutes left here. But let me just give a quick thought on Christian engagement. Again, there's so much more that can be said. Let me just give one quick thought. The famous Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas, he once said, and I have to give Dr. Nathan Cartagena of Wheaton College. He brought this to my attention, and so I want to give him some accolades there. But Thomas Aquinas said that in Scripture, secular wisdom is often represented by water. So secular wisdom is represented by water, and divine wisdom by wine. Okay, so keep that picture sort of in your mind. He goes on to elaborate on this more when Aquinas is commenting on the works of another philosopher, Boethius. He says, nevertheless, it can be said that when one of these two things passes into the nature of the other, the product is not considered a mixture except when the nature of both is altered. Wherefore those who use philosophical doctrines in sacred scripture in such a way to subject them both to the service of faith do not mix water with wine, but change water into wine. In other words, what he's saying is when you take some of these secular or philosophical doctrines, maybe something like a critical race theory or critical legal studies or a critical theory, what my friend Cameron McAllister talked about last month, when you take these things and subject them to the rigors of Scripture, you get something that can be quite fulfilling and quite helpful. Now, our call as Christians is to be disciples and followers of Christ. And as we think about how Christ dealt with people, he dealt with people of all different types of belief. He engaged with people who thought differently than him. And it's interesting that his sharpest rebukes didn't come from those who thought differently than him necessarily, but those who were considered to be the religious elites of his time, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But interestingly, as we think more about engaging with particularly secular ideologies or things like that, Paul comes to mind. And you see in Acts, Paul was sort of on this Mediterranean speaking tour, and he was experiencing some persecution. So some of his traveling mates, Silas and Timothy, they put him on a boat to get out of Thessalonica, and he ended up on the shores of Athens. Now, when he got there, the text says that his heart was stirred, and I think that's somewhat of a diluted language in our English translation. If you look at it more in the Greek, that stirring is more of anger, of frustration, of disappointment. It's a stronger rebuke in many ways. Now, why was his heart stirred? His heart was stirred because as he looked out on the landscape that he came to see on the shores of Athens, their landscape was replete with idols everywhere. In fact, one historian said that when you would come to the shore of Athens, there will be a 40-foot tall statue by the Roman goddess Minerva that will greet you again on your arrival. Now, I don't know if this statue was there when Paul arrived, but it's another example of just how replete idols were within the Athenian culture. But why was his heart stirred by this? Why was he so frustrated or angered? Because he knew the implications of these false gods and idols. He knew that it could lead to a perverted morality or futility or hopelessness. And he knew that he had a better message for them. So he went and he engaged with them. He didn't see these things and immediately erect a wall of dissension or disengagement. He did the opposite thing. He went and talked to the Stoics. He went and talked to the Epicureans, and they eventually brought him to the city council of the area, the Areopagus. And we know what he says when he's at the Areopagus. What is the first sentence that he says? Men of Athens, I see that you are quite devout. Now, of course, his thoughts towards being devoted would be, of course, to Jesus. But what he was trying to do, he knew that they were spiritual. And so he was trying to find a bridge in the conversation with them, to engage them. Because if he didn't build that bridge, he would never be able to give them the sweetest thing that he could possibly give them. And that's a distinctively Christian hope to come to bear upon their lives. And one thing that he did during that talk that was so important, and especially important for us in this conversation with critical race theory, is that he quoted a Greek philosopher, the Greek philosopher Epimenides. And there's a whole history behind that I can tell you about, but just know that this was a cultural part of his speech that he would go on to mention to them. It wasn't like a distinctively Christian thing. And this is important for us because in doing this, Paul essentially used that secular water, the secular notions, the secular thoughts that was within the within whatever Greek message that Epimenides was saying, and he used it and he turned that secular water into sanctified wine. This is so important for us as Christians as we attempt to engage in some of these secular ideologies and philosophies and things like that. Are there things that they can teach us? Yes, there is. Are there differences that we're going to disagree with? I don't agree with many things within critical race theory. There are some things that I think that can be helpful. The fact is that there are a lot of racial disparities and inequities that continue to exist in our world. And we need people to help us to see those things so that we can be the light of the world and bring the Christian perspective to bear on these issues. I'll say this one last thing in closing. I saw, I think about a week or so ago, an article where it was a little over 200, I think maybe 215 shallow graves were found of First Nation children in Canada at this old boarding or reform school of that. And when I saw that, I felt like Paul. My heart was just stirred. I particularly started to think about a friend of mine who's Native American, and we go to the same church. The fact is that a lot of the historical issues around race and ethnicity continue to go on today. A lot of the implications continue to be a part of our society. As Christians, we have to figure out what's the best way to engage these things. How can we, and to engage them, we have to be able to identify and to acknowledge them. And frankly, I think that critical race theory can be helpful in doing that. Again, we don't need to engage every part of critical race theory. We don't need to subscribe to every single aspect of it. But just like many things, whether it's a a talk where someone is mentioning a true statement that an atheist said or someone of another worldview. We don't have to subscribe to everything to engage with what can be helpful and what could be ultimately true. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to engaging you more in Q&A, and God bless.
Hi, Brandon. Thank you for joining us for this Q&A. We have a bunch of people listening. We have a bunch of questions. So I kind of wanted to start, though, just maybe in clarifying some of your position within critical race theory, because I think there's some questions that are surrounding that. I want to make sure that we're addressing the right things. So you seem to be promoting a position that sees some merit in maybe some aspects of critical race theory, and then just feeling very happy to disagree with parts of it as well. But I think what you mostly seem to want to present is a way to be able to speak to people who are engaging in critical race theory to bring them towards the gospel, I guess. Look at some of those places where you can bring them towards the gospel. Am I characterizing this correctly? Could you maybe flesh that out a little bit for us?
Yes. Thank you, Janice. And first, let me say I'm so happy to be here again. I would love to be there in person and look everyone in the eyes and be able to communicate like that. But this is definitely the next best thing. So again, thank you everyone for just tuning in for a moment. But yeah, thank you for that. It's so important that we clarify these things so there's no misunderstandings. Yeah, I would say that you're right on. You're spot on there. There are some things that I think that we can learn from it, and there are some things that I would disagree with. I would liken it to a lot of different theories and all different, I guess, different genres of jobs like economics, sociologists, psychologists. All of these different fields have various types of theories. And actually, if you look at, I think there was an article in Psychology Today, and it might just be titled like "What is psychology?" And it talks about what are psychological theories, and it talks about how psychological theories are actually used to help guide practices and things like that. These theories may not be the end all be all, but they can help as guides to help figure out some issues that might be going on. So they're just maybe little stones that help you along the path. And for critical race theory, I do think that there's some merit in it, just like I think there's merit in a lot of different theories. There are some things, I'm sure you and maybe the listeners have heard the phrase chew the meat and spit out the bone, or what's the other one? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, those types of things. So I think as Christians too, again, I was trying to my best to model what I think goes back to our call back in Genesis 1:27, when we're called to, when we're the Bible describes us as image bearers of God. Image bearers of God doesn't just mean that we sort of hold these cognitive faculties that are above other parts of God's created order. No, it really means that Hebrew word selim really refers to us being representatives of God. So when I think of myself as a Christ follower and a representative of God, and I'm looking for opportunities to engage people, that I engage people all the time to think very differently from me, and I'm sure you all do as well. So I think when at all possible, we should try to model postures of building bridges and not erecting walls. And a lot of the cultural conversation that I hear around critical race theory is more, if I can be honest, it's a lot of fear mongering. I see a lot of people say things like it's a threat to the gospel. And, these types of things where I think that, again, it just creates more division and walls than opportunities to talk to people about Jesus and really give them, again, like I mentioned in my talk, a distinctively Christian hope.
I think a number of the questions are going to reflect what is maybe the biggest takeaway that we are seeing on the ground of critical race theory? You mentioned at one point in your talk that, well, I guess at the beginning, that there were a lot of misconceptions. If somebody gives sort of a one view, one very concrete view of critical race theory, they're not really getting the nuances of it. And yet, on the ground, I think most of us anyway are hearing one very consistent message, and that is a very polarized whites are racist. Everyone is racist. They can't help but be racist. And a number of the questions that I see coming in are reflecting this. And that is a very divisive statement. And it's a statement where it's very hard to see, if this is central to critical race theory, how then as Christians do we just say, yeah, okay, that must be true, when we don't see that in ourselves and we're not convinced that it's just because we're blind to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. And I'm sorry. I think I called you Janice by mistake.
That's okay.
Yes.
Close.
All the J's. In my house, in my household, myself and my 3 kids, we all have B names. So everyone always confuses us. So I apologize for
That's
that. Yeah, great question. And I first started hearing about critical race theory, I think like a bunch of us, maybe about a year or so ago. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, frankly. I had been doing studies around issues of race and ethnicity for years. I mean, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I'm African American, obviously, and I've had a lot of, even people within my own family have had questions and concerns about Christianity and its ties to racism and things like that in the past. And because of that, it's been hard for them to actually see Christ for who he is and Christianity for what it is. So I've had to wrestle with these issues for a long time. So critical race theory wasn't really something that was on my radar for the longest. But since it had become such a part of the culture and such a firebrand, I wanted to know what it is. And that was one of the things that I heard as well, that critical race theory inherently divides, that it situates this binary of whites being oppressors and blacks being victims or the oppressed, okay? And to the former part of that statement, I would say, what comes to mind, first of all, is I believe it's Romans chapter 8, where it says that there is no condemnation in Christ. So if anyone is condemning anyone else, we know that that's not a Christian attitude or a Christian posture that we should at all,
Adopt.
I guess, yeah, adopt or promote in any way. Thank you. Yeah. So, but I would say though, I would ask, and this is what I've been doing in conversations. I love to ask questions because it really drills down on the issues. I ask people, where are you getting your information? Because part of the issue, one of the things that I have witnessed, and I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is that there's a boatload of misinformation out there. I feel like every day I wake up, there's a new article, and because I've been giving talks on it, I'm constantly reading and looking at videos and things like that. There's a lot of misinformation out there about critical race theory. So what I started to do was actually go to the source material and read it for myself. Now, a lot of the source material is very dense, I'll be honest, very boring, and it's very long. So a lot of people just don't have the time to read these legalese type of text. But doing that will actually help you to understand what critical race theory is. Now, again, to your particular question here, I don't see that narrative by critical race theorists, okay, that all whites are oppressors or all blacks are the oppressed. In fact, in Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of Well, The Permanence of Racism, he talks about specifically how oppression actually affects poor white individuals just as much as people of color, and particularly African Americans. And we have to remember too, I know there's this question of these categories of oppressed and oppressor. These are categories, I won't go too far into detail on this in case someone has a specific question on it, but these are categories that the Bible talks explicitly about, all the way from Genesis to, I think it's the book of James that talks about it as well. So these are categories that exist in our world due to sin. Okay. The question is then, of course, should they be relegated to a certain group? Of course not. And again, I don't think that CRT does that. What CRT is actually doing is it's acknowledging and recognizing. It's sort of an empirical recognition of racial and ethnic oppressions in hierarchies, if that makes sense. So I would, again, just as a wrap up, I would say that in my readings of primary source documents from Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, Gene Stefanik, Kimberly Crenshaw, and I can name some other ones. I've never seen anyone accuse all whites of being oppressors and all blacks of being oppressed.
So then you do talk about oppression as being very central to the theory. How would oppression be defined by critical race theorists then that you have read?
So implicitly, I'm trying to think of if I read that they've specific. I think there's an assumption of sort of a shared, whereas CRT has variances of definitions, and even racism to a certain extent, they would differ, I think, a bit on that definition. Oppression itself, I can't think of an instance where they specifically define it, but I would say there's the implicit sort of general definition that oppression is when people are subordinated through, by various means, whether it be through laws or through other various types of coercion. So I would say that the typical general definition of oppression would be ones that critical race theorists would agree with.
So it's kind of interesting because Christianity has been oppressed and increasingly is being oppressed in society, and yet I don't think so. I suppose it doesn't have race, but if we're looking at oppression, we don't tend to see that brought into the definition of groups that are oppressed. And often, at least in society, you hear the term of, previously privileged, and so then it is okay for you to be oppressed. And I think Christianity would fall in that. Have you heard this language about, previously non-oppressor, previously powered or previously privileged groups, and that it's okay to then oppress those groups within the framework of maybe I'm getting a little bit more into critical theory, but let's do it from the lens of critical race theory right now.
Okay, so I'm sorry, can you clarify? Say, are you asking me? I know you mentioned Christianity, but
yeah,
you're saying that groups that have been previously oppressed, is that what you're saying? That
I'm saying that sometimes we talk in maybe it's more broadly in critical theory, but there is this notion of previously privileged groups and how it would be. We're not really looking to get rid of oppression. We're looking to, sometimes it's argued almost to reverse that. So if you were previously privileged, it is fine for you to now sort of be more oppressed, or at least brought nice and low in society. Is that talked about in the sort of theory, or is that just maybe more on the popular level as well?
I think that's on the popular level. In fact, one of the tenets that I mentioned in my talk, and again, I just want to reiterate, because I want to make sure that people know I'm not just making this up or it's conjecture or hearsay or anything like that. But again, I'm getting this from primary source documents. So just a couple of books, if you want to look up some of these things: Critical Race Theory, the introduction; Critical Race Theory, the sort of reader; the subtitle, I believe, is the key writings that formed the movement. There you'll get all the long legal documents you can hope for, and Words That Wound. Right in the introduction, they'll give you some of this. But actually, critical race theorists would say that their aim is, while they're focused more on specifically racial oppression, they see all forms of oppression to all people to be a bad thing. So I've never read anything where they've said that they're seeking to now subordinate those who may in the past have been on a hierarchy or on a higher level because of whatever reasons, past laws or whatever the case may be. So again, some of this is part of the contemporary cultural, how can I say this? Okay, so I don't know how it is in Canada sometimes, and maybe you can tell me, but a lot of times in the United States, I think because of our painful and sordid history, particularly around issues of race and ethnicity, whenever issue or oftentimes when issues of justice and injustice come up, there's a angst against discussing these things. And just like when I mentioned that when I was sort of given the picture of Brown v. Board and Ruby Bridges walking into the room, being escorted into the school for the first time, you had these people talking about how integration was actually communist and Marxist. I have many other examples I can give. I won't go into that because I want to get to some other questions as well. But for example, the label of communist and Marxist is always brought up with these issues. So again, I've never read anything close to that before, and yeah. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. And maybe there is a challenge because it's possible that at least the theorists that you've read are not saying this, but these are the institutions that are, this is the curriculum that is coming into the schools, coming into the federal government, talked about in the media. Companies are being punished if they are, not seen to be promoting a very specific, becoming less white type of a mentality. So, in many respects, we are dealing with how it is being seen at the popular level, regardless maybe of what the theory is saying. So I guess, I guess a good question, another one to kind of make sure we're clear from the beginning is, what is CRT's ultimate practical goal? And perhaps you could talk about CRT, but maybe we also need to talk about how we're seeing it on the ground as well, if there is that disparity, which certainly from my standpoint, I'm seeing. I'm assuming you're seeing some of that too, where you sit in the United States.
Yeah, so to your question about the I think it was like in the institutions and on the ground and things like that. One thing that I'm noticing as I'm reading these articles is I very rarely there's one actually very famous sort of evangelical church organization in the United States, and they put out a message and against critical race theory. And I'm reading through it, and I'm like, okay, where's the specific definition of critical race theory? And so what I'm seeing a lot, and what I'm reading and what I'm hearing from people is that critical race theory. Actually, yesterday a friend sent me a video of this parent at a parent-teacher conference, and she's literally at this parent-teacher conference crying her eyes out, saying that she doesn't want her children to be taught critical race theory. And but as she talks about it, I'm listening to what she's saying, and I have three children and one on the way. So anyone who's concerned about kids' education is, they get the A and a thumbs up in my book. But as I'm hearing her describe critical race theory, I'm just thinking to myself, well, that isn't critical race theory though. So I think there's so much miscommunication, and there's a vagueness to it that it's sort of like there's this nebulous nature where everything is sort of becoming critical race theory. And if everything is critical race theory, then nothing becomes critical race theory. I saw this one educator who talked about how she's going to talk about critical race theory, and it had everything dealing with diversity, to justice, to injustice. And I'm like, okay, these are things you have to be more specific to actually reference critical race theory. Again, it can't be so broad. But then to get more specific to your other question, I think you asked to drill down a bit on what critical race theory is actually trying to achieve. So again, it's not so easy to say because there's so many different critical race theorists. And like I mentioned, there's the two specific kinds. There's the materialists that are dealing with really the real world situations, and there's uh, um, the discourse. I believe it's called analysts or something like that, and they believe, and they're looking at more of the ideas that surround race and racism and ethnicity and all these things. Ultimately, I think their goal is to continue to examine this relationship between race, ethnicity, law, and legal culture, and how it has and continues to subordinate certain groups of disadvantaged, particularly communities of color, and also seek to remediate those instances. So again, I know that's a broad, not very simple definition, but it's because critical race theory really isn't very simple in and of itself because of its variances.
Okay, let's move into a few other questions just to bring flesh this out a little bit more. We have a question that states critical race theory forces Black people to adopt a victim mindset. And I guess we should say people of color or people of a visible minority. It's not necessarily just Black. So to adopt a victim mindset, and white people, and I think it is really just white people, to adopt a guilty mindset. Isn't this unbiblical and isn't this unhealthy? Isn't this a bad end or goal?
Yes, I would definitely agree that um, that any pressure to feel to be, I give a talk on slavery in the Bible, because people often say that, hey, people often conflate slavery in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, with the antebellum slavery that took place here in the United States. And I make my overall point in the talk that there are some very big differences between the two. And one of the things that I note is the psychological or sociological impacts of of uh, of of referring to African Americans as past African Americans as slaves versus enslaved Africans. To some, that may not seem like a big deal, but there's a whole history, and there's been a lot of research that have been done on how these types of labels can actually affect one's psyche and actions and things like that. So whenever if you were to hear me give that talk, you'll usually hear me say enslaved Africans, which points more towards their circumstances, which can be changed, versus slaves, which is more of a blatant categorization. Okay, so I agree that any labels like that are harmful and absolutely unbiblical. I would say though that I don't really see how critical race theory is forcing a victim mindset on African Americans. I can't speak for all African Americans, but myself and I know the individuals that I've talked to, who we have different opinions on some of these things about. I don't see where anything inherent in critical race theory that would say, hey, you are a victim or you are an oppressor. Now, oftentimes what they're doing though is looking at the history, and again, it can be a very, very painful history to examine, but again, I would love to. This is where I wish that we were almost in person and I could maybe ask that person for an example to drill down on it a bit more. But honestly, I don't see where inherent to critical race theory. And if this person, if they have some examples, I would love for you to put another question up, and maybe I can answer a little bit more directly. But I've never seen anything. Again, the important word here is inherent to critical race theory that forces sort of these categorizations on people of color or my white brothers and sisters. So.
And I've certainly heard, testimonies by people, and these are individual, and I only assume that many people feel this way, but testimonies by people who said, I believed in critical race theory, feminism, all these kinds of things. And then I started to kind of realize, wait a sec, I was becoming a victim in all of these. And as soon as I was able to throw that off, I was able to grab hold of the future that I wanted to build for myself. It was actually building their confidence to get rid of that victim kind of mentality. So I guess I would just be concerned. I wouldn't want anybody to take that label on, because it's kind of like the labeling you were talking about with slave versus enslaved. It's a very different. It's a terminology, and it's a label that you can give to yourself, and it's not a healthy one. It's not one that's going to help you move forward, I don't think. We invited people to ask questions that were hard to ask in other circumstances, and so I want to honor that. And so I have a question here that's asking about. You made reference to some acts that happened in the past, sort of in the residential school system here in Canada, or enslaved African Americans in the United States. And the question is, does it really make sense to call a group of people racist because of a history that they had decades ago? I personally wasn't involved in, I might argue that I personally wasn't involved in the residential school system. I might have opposed it. Why am I, as a white person, and it does seem to be given that label, held responsible for that action that was taken by some individuals at a different time? What would you say to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's such an important question. These are some great, great questions. So thank you all. And I have my wife is Canadian. She's from Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. So she makes sure I stay abreast of all the Canadian news as well. So that was part of how I learned about the terrible incident. I'm sure there's something that we all can lament. Of the discovery of those First Nations children's graves.
And I certainly don't want to downplay that either. That
Oh,
is
no,
very
yeah,
important.
yeah,
And I think that is understood in the question and by the questioner.
yes,
And if
yeah,
it's not to the
yeah,
audience, I want to make sure that it is
yeah,
said.
yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm sorry, can you rephrase your question one more
I'm
time?
going to just read it out again.
Okay.
Oh, wait, is it still there? It's not still there on my screen. Can you just bring it back again, if that's possible? Okay, we're not sure how to do that. So it was something along the lines of something has happened in history
Oh, gotcha.
that
I
I
remember.
wasn't part of. I personally
Yes,
wasn't part of, but perhaps it was a white community who was
yes,
imposing
yes,
it on others.
yes,
And it seems that history won't go away. I'm still responsible for it.
yes.
Is that a biblical perspective? Is that right? The person asking the question seems to imply that it didn't seem fair.
Yes. Okay, so yes, so I would say again, like I mentioned earlier about Romans 8 and there being no condemnation in Christ. So that goes without saying. I do want to reiterate that because that's so important to remember in these conversations, because these conversations are hard to have. Again, I would say that there's no we shouldn't. There isn't a responsibility on, let's say, I think in my talk I might have mentioned the Tulsa race massacre. I may have mentioned it, or I may not have, but that was an incident here in the United States where a lot of African American individuals were murdered by a white mob. And this bustling town we actually just celebrated the 100th anniversary recently. I wouldn't take that and then say, present day white men and women are responsible for that. Now, I think the conversation gets a little difficult when, of course, there's something like reparations or whatever that form may take. Okay, whenever that comes up, and then when people say, okay, in the Bible, what do we see? Do we see a repentance for past sins? We actually do see repentance for past sins. We see it in various places in the Old Testament. You see it in, I think it's in Matthew 11, where Jesus is lamenting the sins of the city that refused to see him as a Messiah. So there can be a recognition of past things that have happened, but I would say that there shouldn't be a condemnation or like a finger pointing at a person in present day. But part of it is too, as an evangelist, as an apologist, oftentimes I'll be speaking on issues, and sometimes I get questions on, for example, sexuality, or more specifically, homosexuality, and I'll see a young man or a young woman approach the mic, um, literally about to burst out in tears because of how they've been treated by the church, or by certain individuals within the church. And I start off, and many others start off their answer was saying, "Hey, I'm sorry for what you've gone through." So is that direct repentance on my part? Did I do that? No, I didn't. But I'm still recognizing the pain that this individual went through, and again, seeking to just help them to understand that wasn't a proper teaching or whatever. So it gets a bit more nuanced when we talk about that. But again, I don't think there's a direct correlation between individuals now and past events, unless it's being something that's perpetuated now, but there's not a necessary correlation between the two.
Yeah, and I do have some personal experience with that because one of my sons sat through a class where there was this implication that some past wrongs that were committed here in Canada, there was a direct responsibility to present day generation to make reparation for it. And he asked the question, and it just wasn't really acknowledged that it was not part of our shared responsibility as well. So anyway, if there's other questions around that and people want to post them, that would be great. But let's ask this one here. And I find this one very compelling to me. And Brandon, we met with a number of leaders last week. And one of the individuals quoted a Bible verse that I can't remember exactly where it was off the top of my head. But basically it says that, in Christ, there is no slave or free, black or white, Jew or Gentile. That
Yes.
verse, it talks about unity within the church,
Yes.
and that God is impartial and calls us to be impartial. And the question asks, so since critical race theory divides people by their skin color, wouldn't it be unbiblical? Now, we're starting to talk about there's critical race theory, and then there's what we're actually seeing on the ground. Maybe they're not always exactly the same. Certainly what we're seeing on the ground is that there is that divide. As Christians, how do we struggle through that? And does it mean that the church has a uniquely very different way about going towards that end goal than critical race theory on the ground would have?
Yeah, so let me, it's another great question. Let me clear up a little bit about, I think that's Galatians 6 that you were quoting. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. We are all one in Christ, Christ Jesus. So that verse, like you mentioned, is about unity. But let me drill down a little bit on what Paul was doing there. Paul was saying that he's not saying that some people use that. And I'm not saying that the questioner or even the person who mentioned it last week is doing it, but there is this popular notion sometimes that there's this sort of homogeneous aspect to that verse where we're all one and there's no distinctions amongst us. That's not a case. That's what someone thinks. That's not what Paul is doing here. Paul is actually taking these pairings of groups in his society, that one is often seen on a hierarchy and one is often subordinated, Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or slave and free. And he's saying, hey, the distinctions that often cause these social hierarchies, those distinctions are done away with in Christ. We're all of equal value, worth, and dignity in Christ. So the social like we don't stop being a male or a female because we're in Christ, and they don't lose the distinctions. I don't lose my distinction as being a U.S. Citizen, and you don't lose yours as being a Canadian citizen. So those don't go away. But anything that contributes to a hierarchy within us, that those things are done away. Now you're right too. Critical race theory is very different. The proper understanding of critical race theory and the sort of on the ground. The question then is, who is perpetuating the critical race theory on the ground? So let me ask us to think about something. If someone were to say to us, for Christianity, there's the Christianity of the Bible, and then there's the Christianity on the ground, we would be quick to point them to the authentic Christianity. And that's the same thing, actually, that Frederick Douglass does. And, he was a former slave, but he says in one of his famous speeches, he says, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to reject one as bad, corrupt, and wicked is of necessity to receive the other as good, pure, and holy. There's a distinction that needs to be made. And so that's why I try to, again, promote an attitude of understanding and of going back to the source material and saying, hey, it's actually not being very loving to our critical race theory neighbor if we misrepresent whatever they're trying to achieve. Again, like I said, I don't agree with every aspect of critical race theory, but I think that I would be creating a straw man and doing them a misjustice. And part of, as an apologist, that's what I do with Christ, right? A lot of people have misunderstandings of who Christ is and of Christianity, and I try to listen to whatever ideas they have about Christianity and try to clear those up for them so they can see Christ for who he is and Christianity for what it is. And so I think integrity compels us to do the same with critical race theory, whether we agree with it or not. That's just a part of having integrity and being, just having integrity for that. So.
I think it would be remiss if we didn't ask a question about the Black Lives Matters movement. Some people say they associate critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement with Marxism. This question is asking about why that is the case. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the Black Lives movement in general, though, as well. I know I'm asking two questions with that. Sorry. I think it's a really important one, and I know that it's one that people in some of the churches here in Ottawa are struggling with as Christians. Can we support it? Can we not support it? Could you give some insight into that?
Yeah. So Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was, of course, started on the heels of, I'm trying to think, it was one of the incidents between with a white police officer shooting and killing an unarmed black male. And I believe it was the Trayvon Martin. It was either the Trayvon Martin or the incident that happened right before it. I can't remember the gentleman's name in my mind. But anyway, that was sort of the genesis of Black Lives Matter. And the whole point behind that movement was and is the fact that it's not that other lives don't matter. That's taken as sort of a given. Their motto is Black Lives Matter essentially too, that they're precious. And of course, as Christians, we would affirm that, as we would affirm the value of lives for all ethnicities. So they're trying to bring a recognition to the ongoing issues, particularly with the that has gone on in the United States with the history of police and the Black community. So that's what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing. Now, whether I'll get to the Marxism part in a second, but whether churches should join with them, I think I'm hesitant to tell a church what to do on that. I would just say that we have to look for opportunities to come alongside those particularly disadvantaged people groups and communities, some of the most vulnerable in our society, whether that's Black people, whether that's white people, whether that's Native Americans, First Nations people, whoever that may be. And I don't think that we have to prayerfully and carefully decide which movements we would get behind necessarily. But I also don't think, sometimes I think we have a mentality as if everything that they believe doesn't line up with everything that is a Christian doctrine, that we can't have any association with that. But I'll tell you what, I'm sure glad that Jesus didn't have that attitude when he dealt with a lot of people. If you remember, the story of when he was invited to sort of a dinner party in a way, and this woman who had all types of things said about her around town came in and knelt at his feet and started sobbing and wiped his feet with her hair. Now, if you remember, people at that party, at that sort of dinner party, had all types of things to say about her and whispered about his association with her. But the fact that she was an image bearer of God, that she was someone who was in need, who was in pain, and things like that, Jesus saw an opportunity to come alongside her. So, I think it's something that churches will have to prayerfully consider on what to do. But I would just say, don't let the fact that, and this is not just for Black Lives Matter, for anything, right? Don't let the fact that you may not agree totally on everything mean that you can't come together and try to work towards a common goal. And of course, that was part of the example that I gave with Paul and his dealings with the Athenian culture. Now, let me say one word about the Marxism part, if I may. So I think the Marxism association with Black Lives Matter happens because I believe one or two of the progenitors of Black Lives Matter, I think they may have said something, some type of association. Honestly, I'm not sure, but I think they may have made some comments about Marxism or socialism or being trained in that theory. So I don't want to say too much about that because I'm not 100% sure, but I think that may be where it came from. But with CRT, the association often comes, and I think my good friend Cameron McAllister, I think he may have mentioned some of this last month, but there are some associations or loose associations with Marxism going back to critical theory and critical legal studies and things like that. Now, critical race theory is a little different because, again, the forefather is Derek Bell, okay? So the question then becomes, was his influence dealing with Marxism? And his influence, you can actually see right from the beginning of, right, I think it's right in the introduction or part of the front cover of one of his books. You see a picture of Tommy Smith and I believe it's John Curry, the two Black individuals who were at the 1968 Mexico Summer Olympics. And it's a famous picture where both of them are sort of raising their fists in like a Black Power kind of stance. That's showing part of the influence of Derek Bell. So his influence goes back to the Civil Rights era, to W.E.B. Du Bois, to Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King. These types of thinkers are what influence him. As far as I know, he's never read any Karl Marx. Furthermore, critical race theorists actually find classical Marxism to be very constricting because classical Marxism will say that racism is actually an offshoot of the issues with classism. But the critical race theorists would say, no, you're not paying enough attention to the how integrated racism is in our culture and the prevalence of it from antiquity to now. So there's now I'll say this in closing on this because there's really a lot that can be said about this, but I'm trying to keep it short. Whenever someone talks about power dynamics, particularly around any issues with class, there's an automatic association of Marxism. So I think that's why there's association that people think that sometimes, but really there's no explicit association with Marxism widely from critical race theorists. Could it be one or two that subscribe to it that I may not have heard of? Possibly, but again, from everything that I've read, I haven't seen anything like that.
I know there's certainly a Marxist link with critical theory, and since critical race theory came out of it, That's probably where the connection is being made. I feel like we can't just leave the discussion on Black Lives Matters as it is, because you painted a very amicable picture of it. I think there's quite a lot more to the movement than that. We have seen quite a lot of violence from the movement. We've seen quite a lot of objection or opposition to nuclear family, for instance. I think that the ideology is quite a bit different from Christian worldview and ideology. Can you talk about this a little bit? I mean, you've been looking for opportunities and you've been emphasizing where there might be opportunities, but I think we need to really be aware of where there are some very big worldview differences. Even if we say terms, say removing oppression, we could mean completely different things by those terms. So I feel like I don't want to leave this discussion
Sure.
just based on just making it sound like this is a great option for some people, because I think there's a lot more to it than that.
Well, sure. There's a lot more to it, and there's some would espouse what you said, that they actually had some tenets up on their page, and I think because they began to become more widely spread, they took those tenets down of Black Lives Matter. So yes, they would affirm the uh, the deconstruction of the nuclear family as, but they're looking at it from a um, from what I heard, from what I've heard in the details, they're looking at it from more of a patriarchal view. Anyway, there are some issues with the nuclear family. There's also an affirmation of various sexual identities. So the LGBTQ community, they would affirm those sentiments. I'm trying to think. It's been a while since I've looked at those tenets. I know there's at least one or two other ones that would also conflict with Christianity as well. But I guess, okay, so I'm going to speak to you. So oftentimes, you're gonna have speakers who come from different cultures and different backgrounds who are going to have slightly different perspectives on these things. So I have to tell you, I'm just going to be raw and real with you all. I hope you can receive that with all the charity and grace in the world. But oftentimes, as a African American Christian, I see more angst. I don't see the type of angst toward the things that brought about some of these movements that I do as the movements themselves. So for critical race theory, for example, the question is very rarely asked, well, why do they even feel a need to start something like this? And what other ways do we have as the church of analyzing and observing these ongoing issues in society? In fact, a lot of people would say that there isn't any more issues, that everything is, all good now because we don't have things like Jim Crow laws or the Black Code or slavery or so on, or segregation, so on and so forth. So it can be a little disheartening, if I must admit, as an African American Christian. Again, I'm not representing the whole African American, all African American Christians globally, or in America, but myself, it can be a little frustrating at times. Again, just that there's this angst more against the movement itself than some of the things that brought it about. When a lot of times you have your Black brothers and sisters that's telling you, hey, there's issues going on, and man, I really would love for you to come and join me in this pain, to bear one another's burdens, as we all should, whether it's whatever we're going through in life. So yeah, I don't mean to dilute any of the differences between Black Lives Matter and Christianity at all. There are some stark differences, so I'm glad that you brought that up again. But again, also, with most movements, you're very rarely going to find 100%, being in accordance. So yeah.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, one of the people in our audience has brought the point that there often is a focus on negatives rather than positives with CRT, and it's maybe that, especially on the ground, like we were talking, it may be a bit of a pushback on some of these negatives rather than trying to build towards something positive. But I think it's a fair point. Let's look at roots, and let's be mad at roots, and let's build. And I think for some people it's a challenge. I know I myself, I feel like, but I have friends of every different nationality, and I love them all, and I'm so glad that they are part of my life. And so to when I hear that, I'm racist and I can't think about it, and there's all this oppression, it's hard for me to see it in my own little milieu. And I think that maybe there's a lot of people in our audience who feel that as well. I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I guess what I would love to hear from you is some kind of a challenge to us as the body of Christ. What can we make of this? What can we do with it? What do we not pursue about it? What do we pursue? Maybe just what we do pursue about it. Can you tie up, sort of summarize where you think as a Christian community we need to be, how we want to build reconciliation within our church, and try outside. We talked last time, maybe there isn't a lot of openness to reconciliation, but how can we be salt and light in this?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for these. Thank you everyone who's watching and listening for these wonderful, insightful questions. Again, we're just scratching the surface on all these difficult issues with so many nuances. So again, I just appreciate you all bearing your heart and your cares and concerns through your questions. I would say that as the church, critical race theory has caused such really a division within the church. Let's start, before we go outside of the church, let's talk about in the body of Christ itself. It's caused such division, such divides. You see, for example, in the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, there's other things going on there, but critical race theory was one of them also. And you had people leaving and people saying other things. And so it's causing these divisions. And, to that, I would say, I'm reminded of Jesus's words in John 17. Oftentimes when I'm given various talks on apologetics issues, whether it's the resurrection or issues of science and faith or whatever the topic may be, I pretty much inevitably get someone who asks me for that silver bullet apologetic argument. Brandon, what's the best argument? What can I say to them that's going to get them to become a Christian? Various ways that people ask that. And you say, I know, people are different. So people are going to react to things differently based on their backgrounds and circumstances. But John 17, I think, is something that we all need to be reminded of when Jesus says, the world, will know that you are my disciples by the love that you have for one another. And so I would challenge us respectfully and humbly to really think about, pray about, what does that love look like? I'm reminded of the type of love when I think about my wife, for example, and in Ephesians, where Paul talks about that men are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And I have to constantly ask myself, am I loving my wife in that way? It's not that I just love her when things are going great, but Christ loved us in a sacrificial way. And I think back to when I wasn't following Christ, and maybe some of you can remember those days too, when you were living possibly in direct rebellion to Christ, and still he loved you and he loved me enough to sacrifice himself. That's the kind of love that we have to have, I think, for one another. And sometimes that means in these tough discussions, sitting back and listening and saying, hey, we disagree, but let's figure out a way that we can come together on something, or some aspects of this, or maybe let's spend some more time and let's talk through some of these things. Because oftentimes, one of my good friends is, I'm from urban city, Detroit. One of my good friends is from rural West Virginia. And I remember we were talking about the phrase white privilege and like what it means and all those types of things. Now, based on my background, this is what my understanding of it. And he said, hey, based on his background, this was his understanding of it. But we spent so much time. We actually became so close discussing some of these hot button issues because we cared enough to really understand each other. We weren't trying to win an argument. We weren't trying to promote our political leanings or whatever the case may be. We cared about each other as brothers in Christ. So I want to challenge us to do that, and that's sort of within the church. With outside of the church, again, I want to challenge us to ask ourselves the question: where is your Athens? Where is the place that perhaps where God is calling you to speak to individuals, to proclaim this distinctive, beautiful, and fulfilling hope and love that can only be found in Jesus Christ? I gave that example from Paul for a reason, and I can give much more details to that story, so you can really see how in direct opposition to Christianity, the Athenian culture really was. For Paul to go in there and again try to be a bridge builder. And Jen, you brought this up about reconciliation. Paul talks about in Second Corinthians that we all have a ministry of reconciliation. That is our goal. And this ministry of reconciliation is not only on a horizontal level as far as our relationship with God, but it's also with each other. So that's what I would challenge us with: unity inside the church and outside the church, and just seeking again to be faithful, loving representatives to him.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for being with us and for being on the hot seat for so many questions, and for sharing your heart and sharing some of your life and your studies. Really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for the great questions. Of course, there are some that we weren't able to get to, but I did try to blend some of them together. So hopefully you had some feeling that yours were being answered, even if I didn't read it exactly. I just wanted to remind our audience, this is our last dialogue for this series, but we will be back with a conference in the fall, which is always the first Friday and Saturday in November. And it's looking like we might be able to do something live. We're kind of preparing for every scenario, maybe part live, part online, to kind of see where things are going. By the time, surely by November, right, we'll be able to do something live like that. So stay tuned. We're going to be posting things through social media and our website as time goes on, and you'll find out those details as we go along. And thank you for joining us. And we're signing out now, and we'll see you again in the fall.